Fall at Equestria, The Quiet City. By Gamma Deekay. Read by Forrest M. 2 days.
Lonely, desolate, silent.
These 3 words were all that came to the mind of the traveler who stood atop the hillside ruins on the outskirts of a once great city. From on top of a crumbling slab of charred wall, a stallion in an orange hazmat suit overlooked the dozens of blackened and twisted bones that used to make up the numerous skyscrapers and commercial office buildings. The city once had been built up around the shores of the now yellowed and murky waters of a peaceful northwestern bay. To the southeast from where he stood, a charcoal-black crater carved a barren chunk out of the city. Its still, brightly glowing center ebbed and flickered like a fire, while the edge of the blast had cut through the remains of the now burned-out suburbs. The stallion began to wonder if he'd ever visited the city before the bombs. It looked so alien to him now, and he couldn't bring himself to look away from the epicenter of its destruction. It was the lasting and uncontestable headstone to the now forever quiet city. It was a grim sight to behold, but he'd come to terms with the end of the world he once knew many miles ago down the road. The magical radiation counter on his dirty and worn-out hazmat suit spoke to him in soft, quick crackling ticks. The noise made the stallion reflectively hold his breath. The sudden strain on his lungs had not been well timed, and he was forced to give out a wheezing, light cough. Tiny flecks of blood coated the stallion's scraggly beard, along with the interior of his helmet's face mask. The crimson specks caught the stallion's eye and sent a brief flash of fear through his tired eyes. Bringing his hoof up to read the dusty rad meter, he inspected the patchwork he'd done around it a few days ago.
I should have used less adhesive. Need to conserve what I got left,
he thought to himself before focusing on the ticking rad meter. The thin black needle barely moved from its resting place as a light breeze picked up. Shortly, the soft wind built into a droning wail that drove through the ruins below him, sending his meter spiking a few times. But like the world itself, it quickly died and dropped him back into the eerie, oppressive silence that filled the dead city.
So as long as the wind doesn't stay consistent, I should be fine.
Looking back to the horizon, he turned his eyes skyward. The dark gray cloud cover that had closed off the skies all looked the same to him. With a sigh, he couldn't even bring himself to curse the Pegasi anymore for sealing away the sky. As much as he hated them, it was only because he was jealous that they didn't have to deal with this hellish wasteland. Still, the brooding clouds hanging quietly above him weighed on his mind.
Looks like rain,
he offered as a thought, though he could never quite be sure what the weather would hold for him anymore. Looking down, he got back to the task of observing the ruined city. The black haze of still smoldering wreckage that drifted throughout the silent ruins didn't help to comfort him either. More than anything, the stallion had feared getting lost, or worse, trapped while scavenging for water and food. Casting a careful gaze over the city, the stallion squinted as he scrutinized potential sites to search for supplies and to use as shelter.
2 days to cross the city, 3 maximum.
He nodded to himself.
Then it's back on the road north again.
A flash blinded the stallion, and a resounding boom filled the air. The stallion dropped to the ground and slid down the rubble wall as his legs gave out from under him. He curled his hooves over his head and used his magic to surround himself with a weak shield spell. The frightened stallion let out a pitiful whimper.
Oh, Celestia, it's happening again.
Trembling, the stallion listened, waiting and bracing for the coming balefire blast wave. However, no wave was to come. only the same silence that had been around him since he began his journey. Another frightening boom filled the air without warning, rumbling off over the silent city and great hills around him. A soft pattering against his helmet made him silence himself. The stallion slowly opened his eyes and looked to the dark skies again. Droplets of rain splashed against his foggy face mask. One at a time at first, but soon they had begun to pick up. A light rain fell over the area, pelting the stallion as the dark clouds pulsed with lightning along the horizon.
Oh, I guess I was right.
The stallion sighed with relief. However, with the thoughts of rain came the aggravating reminder of just how parched his throat felt.
Damn it. Why did I have to be right?
With a grumble, the stallion picked himself up as another burst of thunder drifted over the horizon. Climbing back up the rubble, he once again turned his vision out toward the city, now in search of somewhere to wait out the storm. A few promising candidates sat not far out from where he stood. As much as he didn't like it, the outskirts of downtown would have to do for tonight. He began looking at the remains of an old apartment building that hadn't been completely gutted by the balefire on the final day of the old world.
Nah, probably full of shamblers.
Turning his gaze, he viewed the smoldering remains of what looked like it was once a Ministry of Peace hospital.
No, probably a bandit trap by now.
Shifting his gaze again, he stopped upon the open, flat football field that sat the farthest out of all of them. He couldn't quite see it clearly from where he stood, but he had a good feeling about spending the night in the city's old high school stadium.
Yeah, that might work.
Looking further beyond that, only the ruins of residential and industrial buildings aligned what he could make out to be the far side of the city. His ears perked as the sound of crumbling rubble came from somewhere behind him. Again, the stallion dropped to the ground, sliding down to the muddy dirt as another blast of thunder rolled across the sky. His heartbeat spiked again, and his shaking hooves quickly fumbled open the travel bags he wore over his protective orange suit. From inside, a revolver floated shakily into the air, wrapped in the green magical aura his horn shared. The patter from the rain picked up, growing heavier to mask the surrounding ruins with a steady drumming. The stallion pulled the revolver close to him, frantically scanning the piles of brick and steel that sat scattered like jagged hills. Even in the dull light that filtered through the dark cloud cover, the shadows the rubble cast were dark enough to send electric tingles down his spine every time that he looked at them. The thought that he only had 3 rounds left for his only means of defense was lost to him as he waited patiently for whatever had followed him to show itself. He wouldn't be stopped, not so close to the end of his trek. Still, the only noise outside the rain to meet his ears was his own recycled wheezing breaths as he sat crouched next to the rubble.
I've been here too long already. Need to keep moving.
The stallion picked himself up out of the dirt and got back to his hooves. The rubber soles that capped each of his protective suit's boots allowed him to be nearly silent as he trotted away. But the stallion knew that silence alone sometimes wasn't good enough to make it through the ruined cities. With his pistol still held close, he did his best to keep the old school stadium in sight as he trotted deeper into the quiet, dead city. The thundering rain that poured down from the dark skies outside echoed through the empty long halls that led to the hoofball field's locker rooms. Stormy nights like this were of great comfort to the stallion on his long journey. Not only did it deter other scavengers from researching his shelter while he rested, but it brought back the sound to the world. It wasn't until he'd been on the road for a few days that he'd noticed just how much silence filled the world now. There had been so much hustle and bustle in his life before the final day. Things during the war had gotten so noisy, but like every pony else, he'd just gotten used to it. Now, that was all gone, and all he had left was the sound of his own recycled breathing. Nights like this were a gift, as the sound of the rain was the only companion that had traveled with him all this way. A soft banging emanated through the concrete corridors from inside the locker room halls. With a rending squeal, the front of the Sparkle Cola vending machine flew open. The stallion took a step back, dropping the pry bar from his magic as a few of the glass bottles inside the machine tumbled out and shattered at the stallion's hooves. Undeterred, the stallion quickly shoved as many bottles as he could out of the machine into an old janitorial bucket he'd found. With the bucket and pry bar in tow, he trotted back towards the stalled showers in the far back of the room. He wore a look of contentment at his haul as he approached the softly flickering fire he'd built in one of the stalls. His orange hazmat suit had been hung out to dry over the edge of the overturned laundry cart he planned on sleeping in tonight. The towels inside, though unwashed, would make a fairly good blanket for him when the fire went out. The small fire was already threatening to die, but still lightly danced and crackled over the shower drain cover. It didn't provide much light, and it filled the musty locker room air with the stinging smell of soot. But the stallion had much preferred that over the darkness and smells in some of the shelters he'd had to spend the night in. Setting the bucket and pry bar down near the edge of the stall, the stallion rubbed his chipped and cracked hooves together before holding them over the fire. His damp and matted dark brown fur still clung to him in some places on his emaciated forelegs. Twisting his forehooves, he looked over at the bald spots where the beginning stages of magical radiation sickness had formed purple and black sores. Taking a deep breath, he closed his eyes and lowered his hooves back down. Cracking one eye open, he looked down at the bucket filled of Sparkle Cola. He couldn't fight the smile that broke across his chapped lips. Using his magic, he gripped around one of the Sparkle Cola bottles and flipped the cap off. He pulled the sweet carbonated drink cup toward him, eager to taste the carroty flavor that would become oh so rare in the coming days and the years ahead of him. The rad meter on the protective suit ticked subtly as the bottle moved past it. The stallion froze. His smile steadily shrank as he held the fizzing drink so close to his muzzle that he could practically already taste the carrot flavor.
No.
He attempted to rationalize with himself.
Maybe it was just a fluke.
The bottle in his levitation wavered unsteadily as he couldn't justify taking a single sip to himself. Slowly, he lowered the bottle down towards the suit again. With perked ears, he listened intensely. The closer he moved the bottle, the more aggressively the counter rang out. With an angry shout of frustration, the stallion threw the bottle from his magic and shoved the bucket of irradiated cola across the room. The room was momentarily filled with the sound of breaking glass as the stallion vented his anger. The metal bucket, however, bounced a few times from his throw. It traveled along the concrete floor with a rough grinding noise, rolling back and forth a few times before coming to a stop, and leaving only the sound of the fire and the stallion's heavy breaths. With a whimper, the stallion stared at the mirror that still hung on the wall near where he'd thrown the poisonous bottles. He trembled, getting to his hooves and choking back the feelings of hopelessness that clawed at his mind as his reflection drew clearer in the mirror. His tired green eyes were slightly jaundiced and had saggy bags under them. The scraggly, mint-colored mane that drooped over his head was thin and patchy. Even the beard he'd grown out over the journey was less full than it felt inside the stuffy hazmat helmet. Looking over himself, his ribs clung to his skin as he breathed, and even his cutie mark had deformed around his emaciated hips. As if to add insult to injury, a gurgling squelch emitted from his waist as he looked at it.
Was it 2 or 3 days ago?
He couldn't remember the last time he had anything to eat. He felt hungrier than he ever had before, and carried a thirst with him that at that time already felt unquenchable.
Tomorrow I'll eat. That's when I'll find something.
Slowly, the worn-out stallion forced himself to walk back and climb into the old laundry hamper. The musty towels had grown warm from the heat of the small fire and helped to soothe the stallion's sore muscles as he closed his eyes. A warm bed was more of a luxury than he had in days, and at least for tonight, he was thankful for that much. The storm of yesterday had long since passed by the time the sun was above the horizon. Water dripped and flowed out of the ruins in small rivers, washing with it some of the magical radiation-saturated dust that coated most of the silent city. However, with that cleansing came new dangers. Streams of highly irradiated water drew out a few curious feral ghouls that filled the various ruins in the city. Some of them followed the magical radiation as it bled down the ruins on the hills toward the poisoned yellow water of the bay. As they went, their splashing hooves attracted yet other ghouls to the noise. The silent city itself may have been dead, but most of its current inhabitants had refused to die with it on the last day. It was times like these when the stallion in the protective suit would normally double back on his route, choosing to instead take more time than planned while traveling, rather than risking contact with the ghouls. Today was a day he'd thought the risk was worth it. Quietly, the stallion huddled in the second-floor corner of an old brick building. Pressed up against the dusty brick, he held his hoof tightly over the softly ticking rad meter to muffle it further. Hidden from plain view, he sat there, listening and waiting as a dozen or so curious ghouls wandered by. They splashed along noisily, passing between him and the still intact refrigerator lying exposed on the bottom floor of a ruined house across the street.
Damn shamblers,
he thought, licking his chapped lips. His ears swiveled attentively as the hoofsteps of the ghouls bled off into the distance. Quickly peeking out of the window, he surveyed up and down the street, finding it clear for the moment. This was his moment to go.
All right, I just know I'll find something good in this one.
He removed his trembling hoof from over the softly ticking meter, letting out a soft breath of relief. The floorboards above creaked as they shifted. The half-burned wood strained under the weight of something still alive above him. The stallion gasped lightly, throwing his hoof back over the meter as he pressed himself back against the wall again. The labored hoofsteps of a pony met his ears. Moving slowly across the floor above him, his own eyes darted to the doorway across the rooms he was in. There, the stairwell down to the street sat just through the wide-open doorway, with its splintered door still laying flat from when it was blasted off its hinges in the balefire apocalypse.
Of course there was one upstairs.
The stallion resisted the urge to face Hoof.
Maybe I can slip out quietly before it gets wind of me.
Eyeing out the window again, he scanned the house across the street for another place to hide. Somewhere off in the distance, a gunshot rang through the air. It reverberated and echoed through the ruins. The hoofsteps upstairs stopped, and a low moan filtered through the floorboards. More gunshots. The ghoul upstairs let out a piercing screech, and its hooves hammered across the charred wooden floorboards. Frozen in fear, the stallion fought to keep himself from hyperventilating. With a meaty thump, the ghoul upstairs slammed into the wall near the stairway. It galloped down, again slamming into the wall below before racing across the hallway again to repeat the process. As it passed the doorway, the stallion held his breath. The charred blue pony raced by, seemingly not taking any notice to the bright orange suit cowering in the far corner of the nearby room. Instead, it continued on its frantic path out of the building, hitting every wall it could on the way out. Only when the splashing of the ghoul's hooves in the irradiated river met the stallion's ears did he take a gasping breath.
This would be so much easier if I knew how to teleport,
he thought to himself as he slowly got to his hooves and started moving towards the stairwell. Every step was a gamble, and each creak that came from the floor caused him to hesitate. The thought of the refrigerator being so close yet so far out of reach was almost unbearable. But the stallion knew he must remain calm, focused, and patient. Step by step, the stallion painstakingly made his way down the stairs. The clouds outside were a lighter gray than yesterday, and the sun that filtered down onto the stallion as he made it outside felt warm to him. The wet, muddy ground gave slightly under each hoof step, and his rad meter spiked every few steps. Still, the stallion kept his ears perked as he made his way out into the street.
It's just a hop, skip, and...
he told himself before jumping over the swiftly moving irradiated water that flowed down the hill. As his rad meter maxed out, it let out a shrill, short-lived alarm. Keeping up his momentum from the hop, the stallion threw caution to the wind and dashed into the remains of the nearby house. Out of immediate danger for the moment, the stallion covered his rad meter until it quieted again. The old teal-colored refrigerator was half charred and laying on its back. Most of the house looked like it hadn't fared well in the blast, but the refrigerator was indeed intact. Looking and squinting at the small metal plate screwed onto its side, the stallion emitted a light gasp as he read the words "lead-lined" on it. With a ravenous fever, he reached out with his magic and pulled at the handle. The rubber gasket that had once helped to seal the door had melted from the bombs and now truly sealed it shut. The stallion's stomach let out an impatient gurgle before his horn lit up and opened his bags. A worn and tarnished pair of scissors floated out in his magic. With an aggressiveness normally reserved for the more unsavory kind of survivors, he jabbed the scissor blades through the rubber and began to shear through it. Harder and faster he tried to cut, all the while pulling his hooves on the stubborn door. At last, the rubber gave way and the door opened wide. The stallion dropped the scissors to the floor with a clatter, paying no mind to the noise it made. Instead, he was focused on the prizes inside for all his patience and hard work. Most of the food inside was blackened and rotted, and the few glass milk bottles inside had been broken when the refrigerator had been blasted over. However, 3 items still remained: a single unopened box of Fancy Buck snack cakes and a pair of distilled bottled waters. Taking one of the bottles in his magic, he held his hoof up and pressed the rad meter against the bottle. Silence followed. Frantically, the stallion grabbed at his helmet. With a sharp hiss as the seal detached, the stallion pulled it off as his magic tore the crimped metal cap from the glass bottle. Greedily, he stuffed the bottle into his muzzle and chugged its contents down. But like all things, it didn't last, and the container was emptied in moments. Still, the stallion gave out a sigh, stumbling back onto his flank in contentment. His soft green glow wrapped around the Fancy Buck box, opening it to reveal 2 of the small, fluffy, and individually wrapped confectionery treats inside. He quickly slipped one out, closing the box again before safely stowing it in his bag. As he set the removed cake into his hooves, he reached out again and grabbed the other water bottle in the fridge. With little effort, he slipped it into his bag as well, while using his muzzle to tear at the wrapping around the small cake. It was then that the stallion had first looked around since winning his prize. His body stopped, locking up as he peered down the street from where he'd come. There, standing out in the open among the rubble, was a small pink-coated filly. She didn't wear any clothes or have any sort of protection on her. She was alone and starkly out of place among the blasted ruins of the quiet city. She was like a ghost to him. She was something that he knew couldn't possibly exist out here. Yet, there she was. The long, flowing yellow mane and tail on the filly wavered in the light breeze that swept through the silent city. Her sharp green eyes peered over at him as if she had seen a ghost.
Go, run, now!
The stallion's mind screamed at him. Dropping the cake, the stallion scrambled to his hooves. His heart hammered against his chest, and his hooves thundered at the muddy street. He was gone from the ruined building and galloping up the street away from the strange filly so fast that he wasn't sure how far he'd gone by the time he looked back. However, the stallion had known better to charge blindly through the silent cities. Without warning, the stallion was tackled to the ground. A sharp howling from next to him jarred him as he rolled. He barely had enough time to shake off the hit before his assailant was back on top of him. The feral ghoul mare who hammered at him with her hooves snapped her jaw as the stallion tried to defend himself. His horns sparked and fizzed as he lost his focus during the staggering assault. There was a stiff crunch as the ghoul's hooves damaged the perspective glass on the helmet. A web of cracks crept out from the impact at the corner of his mask. The stallion began to panic, and he reacted with a rash move. A single, simple mistake in trying to block the mare's assault with his forehoof that would cost him dearly. The ghoul seized the opportunity and bit down on his presented leg. Her broken and jagged teeth were like knives, shearing through the worn suit and into the stallion's flesh. He choked back a scream as he torqued and threw himself off her. The pain was immense, but it had for the moment sharpened his focus. Drawing his revolver out, he pointed it at the mare and fired. All 3 shots tore into the feral ghoul, stopping her cold on the ground. The revolver clicked a few times, its hammer falling on each empty cylinder as the stallion's mind worked to catch up. Panting heavily, the stallion's injured leg threatened to give out under him. Bleeding and exposed to the outside world, he had realized the extent of his mistake all too late. Howls and yips of other feral ghouls filled the air, and the stallion knew he had to move.
Run, hide, survive.
Turning toward the closest ruins, he fled down a thin alleyway. Bleeding and whimpering, the stallion hobbled as fast as he could. His eyes frantically searched for somewhere to hide. Falling upon the heavily charred metal from an old dumpster. Its top was still attached and open, which he figured would provide an easy enough way to secure himself once he was inside. As the screams and thundering hooves of many feral ghouls grew closer, the stallion whined and threw himself into a half-burned-out dumpster. As he did, he'd taken notice of the crispy corpse of a Pegasus pony that already laid curled up inside. A pony who had perhaps thought to hide out inside, and was instead cooked alive? He paid no mind to even entertaining those thoughts as he fell in. It was too late to choose another hiding spot, and despite the morbid discovery, the stallion had little choice but to join the unfortunate corpse. Just the impact of falling inside had closed the lid behind him, shielding him from the light of the outside world and some of its only remaining noise. There he sat in the confining, quiet darkness, listening as the dozens of shambling feral ghouls outside investigated their fallen sister.
Celestia, please don't let them find me.